Hey y'all, and welcome to today's lesson on anaerobic respiration. As we learned in our previous discussion, the process of cell respiration converts the chemical energy in glucose into ATP. The entire process sees us consuming glucose and oxygen to produce CO2, H2O, and 36 ATP molecules. Now, that's a lot of ATP that's produced for every one molecule of glucose that's broken down. This process is known as aerobic cellular respiration. It's the chemical process that breaks down glucose in the presence of oxygen in order to form that ATP. Once again, this process really can only happen if you have oxygen. However, there are situations where we're going to need to do this without oxygen. Prior to photosynthetic life existing on this planet, there needed to be a way for organisms to carry out cell respiration as it is required for all living things to survive. If we look at the atmosphere of early Earth, or even some places during current day Earth, we'll find a distinct lack of oxygen. How can living beings exist in such extreme environments? How do we get oxygen to like the very bottom of the ocean or to areas where there are significantly less amounts of oxygen that are needed to survive? Well, early organisms, bacteria and archaea, before those photosynthetic organisms existed, they needed to do anaerobic respiration. In anaerobic respiration, anaerobic stands for without oxygen, and respiration is the chemical process that breaks down ATP or breaks down glucose into ATP. They did anaerobic respiration. It is a method of cell respiration that is possible without the use of oxygen or mitochondria for that matter. The process occurs when the body's cells are not provided with enough oxygen to perform aerobic respiration, such as if you're exercising a bit too hard or if you're finding yourself short on breath. At that point, not enough oxygen is getting to your muscles, yet you still need to make energy. It's kind of a backup method of cell respiration that's really only used when your body lacks the key component in aerobic respiration, but still needs to make ATP. So, anaerobic respiration, it's cellular respiration that occurs in the absence of oxygen, and there's a few differences between aerobic and anaerobic respiration. As you can see, both require glucose. However, in the absence of oxygen, the process of respiration produces significantly less ATP. As you remember, in aerobic respiration, it produced 36, and in anaerobic, it only produced 2. However, you'll notice that there are byproducts, and they're fairly different depending on what organism undergoes cell respiration. We're going to cover those in just a second. The most important thing to recognize is that in anaerobic respiration, there's no oxygen required, but it does make significantly less ATP. All right, there are multiple types of respiration, of anaerobic respiration, all of which are called fermentation. Fermentation is one of the type of anaerobic respiration that occurs during low oxygen availability. And there are two different types we're going to focus on mainly. That is going to be ethanol fermentation, which uses glucose to produce ethanol, CO2, and ATP, and then also lactic acid fermentation. Lactic acid fermentation uses once again one glucose without oxygen to produce lactic acid and once again 2 ATP. The amount of energy you get from this is significantly lower, and you do produce significant amounts of byproducts such as ethanol and lactic acid. But this is a way for organisms to continue making energy in the absence of oxygen. So, there are a few organisms, such as some bacteria and yeast, which is a fungus, which allows them to undergo anaerobic respiration or aerobic or respiration in the absence of oxygen, and it produces ethanol, which is used for alcohol and it's used in different types of food production. However, most organisms, such as prokaryotes, bacteria, most plants, animals, most fungi, and protista, they undergo lactic acid fermentation. If they don't have enough oxygen, they'll create a lesser amount of ATP, but they will also produce lactic acid as a byproduct. This is the reason why your muscles get sore during and after a workout. You've exhausted the oxygen supply in your cells, and we've begun to make lactic acid, giving you that burning sensation and making you tired. Ethanol fermentation, however, produces it's ethanol buildup essentially, which I'm kind of glad we don't have that. Otherwise, every time that we exercise, we get alcohol buildup in our bloodstream. So we do lactic acid fermentation. Most things do lactic acid fermentation, but yeast and some bacteria will undergo alcohol fermentation instead. All right. Real quick, I want to go over a couple things about ethanol fermentation in particular. Ethanol fermentation is used to produce alcoholic beverages. That is done through the production through fungi undergoing ethanol fermentation, and this is known as brewer's yeast. It's that fungus known as brewer's yeast that produces all these different types of alcohols. However, because CO2 is also a byproduct, we're able to use this form of anaerobic respiration to make bread rise. This is called baker's yeast. We use this inside of our bread to, as the CO2 gets released, it rises, pushing up the dough and creating little pockets of air, making the bread fluffy and making it larger. Otherwise, it would be this unleavened kind of cracker. Now, lactic acid fermentation has a myriad of uses. We oftentimes use lactic acid to produce different types of lactic acid to make cheese, yogurt, and other types of tart food, such as kefir, kimchi, sauerkraut, stuff like that. It's the same process by which your muscles get sore, but when performed by a bacterium, we're able to harvest that lactic acid to make food. So rather than making us sore, we use it to make food instead. This is what happens when you deprive a bacteria of oxygen. Same thing happens when you deprive a human of oxygen. It makes that lactic acid. So, for lactic acid fermentation, the process mainly occurs when your body is low on oxygen. Your cells would prefer to make the 36 ATP present in aerobic respiration, as it's a much more efficient use of the glucose. The more energy you get out of the oxygen, the more lactic acid builds up. So, like the more oxygen you have, the better, because when you run out, you start doing this anaerobic respiration and it causes an increase in lactic acid production. This is why you feel your muscles burn. All right. The third and final form of fermentation is anaerobic respiration is methanogenesis. This is the process by which 1-glucose is consumed by a methanogen, which we're going to cover in a second, to create methane and 1-ATP. So this is mainly done by ruminants such as sheep, deer, and giraffe. In this process, the microorganisms known as methanogens utilize the high levels of CO2 and hydrogen produced in cell respiration to produce the greenhouse gas known as methane. It's and only really a single ATP as well. It's very inefficient, but it allows these animals to consume an abundant food source that most animals cannot. So, in addition to the ATP that they get, the methanogens produce additional ATP for themselves using the byproducts of cell respiration. A couple examples. This is an example of a ruminant, a cow, that consumes the grass, and as it consumes the plant material, the methanogens assist in that digestion by converting the byproducts of cell respiration into methane gas. This produces a little bit of ATP, but it also produces that methane gas, which is a greenhouse gas. And it is also you can find these methanogens in all soils, which assist in that process as well. All right, y'all. That's it for today. Have a wonderful rest of your day. And as always, be kind, be safe, and I'll see you all in the future. Peace, y'all.